So now we move on to a different type of highlight. Today's formal plenary talks begin with the brief Best of SWOG updates from several SWOG areas. The first is an update on some important, recently published work from our Statistical Center by that work's lead author, Dr. Joseph Unger. Joe.
Thank you, Dr. Blanke. It's an honor to have this opportunity today. The title of this talk is Comparison of Survival Outcomes Among Cancer Patients Treated in and Out of Clinical Trials. I'd like to acknowledge and thank some of my collaborators who are in the audience today, especially Drs. Barlow, Ramsey, LeBlanc, and Hirschman, and point out that this study was recently published in JNCI. There's my punchline. This being, since we're in San Francisco, I felt obliged to bring that. So we'll start with some background. Clinical trials are designed to optimize internal validity. That is, we want to show that a new therapy has efficacy in a controlled experimental setting. This is achieved in part through eligibility criteria, which must satisfy two opposing factors. On the one hand, they must be sufficiently narrow such that there's a consistent effect across the cohort. On the other hand, they must be sufficiently broad such that the results are generalizable to a meaningful population. So the goal in study design, in part at least, is to define that point of equipoise between these opposing factors. However, clinical trials sometimes are faulted for having eligibility criteria that are too narrow, thus sacrificing external validity or generalizability, and also influencing low clinical trial enrollment rates. So just to give a definition, generalizability is the extent to which observational or experimental study results apply to a broader population. And I think it's useful to characterize generalizability according to three levels. At the first level, we're concerned about whether patient characteristics are representative. However, even if representative, this has to be translated into meaningful outcome differences in order to be meaningful, And then finally, at level 3, we're interested in whether the treatment effect itself is generalizable. That is, does efficacy in a controlled experimental setting translate to effectiveness in a population treatment setting? Unfortunately, assessment of the treatment effect itself is difficult, since to avoid temporal confounding, it requires a comparison between experimental and standard arm treatments occurring in the general population at the same time as the clinical trial is conducted, which is not supposed to happen, although occasionally it does. The literature on generalizability analyses has been summarized in 4 prominent reviews, all of which provide a mixed picture regarding the comparability of outcomes between trial and non-trial patients. In the past decades, these 4 reviews have found anything from no evidence to strong evidence that the clinical trial outcomes are similar to non-trial outcomes. However, these reviews are comprised primarily of selected single study comparisons, so there's the potential for subjective study selection. They also have heterogeneous methods and control groups, so this suggests the need for a comprehensive study exploring trial versus non-trial treatment outcomes across multiple diseases using a consistent methodology. So our objective was to assess the generalizability of cancer clinical trial treatment outcomes by comparing trial versus non-trial patients with respect to overall survival. Non-trial data were from SEER, and trial data were from SWOG. And to avoid that subjective study selection that I mentioned earlier that plagues earlier attempts to assess this, I conducted a comprehensive survey of the SWOG Phase 3 trial database over a 25-year period. Studies were included if it was a Phase 3 trial that had been previously published, if it had upfront randomization, since you can't, SEER data cannot reproduce the filtering that goes into second or third registrations like in the SWOG study. The data on essential histology and stage criteria must have been available in SEER, and the trials cannot have been of recurrent disease, since SEER data index cases according to initial diagnosis. With respect to accounting for treatment, SEER does not provide data on receipt of chemotherapy. Oddly enough, they collect it, but they don't provide it. They don't feel it's reliable. Therefore, we compared SWOG patients randomized to the standard arm, representing potentially the standard of care, versus SEER incident cases diagnosed during the SWOG study enrollment period. And assuming that the SWOG standard arm does in fact represent standard of care, then this would allow approximately a comparison between similar treatments. The primary endpoint was overall survival, limited to the first 5 years to emphasize survival related to treatment outcomes. We used Kaplan-Meier and multivariate Cox regression to compare overall survival between trial and non-trial patients, and smoothed hazard functions to explore different shapes of the overall survival curves. So here are the results. There were 102 studies that I examined over that period. 64 were excluded up front, mostly due to being closed early, and other reasons are shown there. That left 38, which were considered formally for the stage comparison, of which 17 were excluded because SEER did not have the essential staging criteria to replicate the SWOG study eligibility, leaving 21 out of 38 studies identified for comparison. The studies were a mix of various diseases, as you can see there, totaling 5,190 total SWOG patients compared to about 70,000 SEER patients. Summarizing the eligibility criteria, nearly all or all studies included criteria to exclude prior cancers or prior treatments for the current cancer, to specify adequate organ function, and to specify a clinical performance status. The average number of eligibility criteria was 16, the majority of which related to comorbidity status. And so this is an important point to keep in mind throughout, is that through design and statistical adjustment, we were able to equate SEER and SWOG patients and databases with respect to histology and tumor characteristics and year of diagnosis and demographic factors, but not most of the other eligibility criteria, most again of which were related to comorbidity status. I then estimated the hazard ratio for overall survival between trial and non-trial patients in a multivariate regression for each study. In order to depict the results in a systematic fashion, I rank ordered the studies in descending order of the average 2-year survival in that column. For the purposes of this analysis, good prognosis was defined as 2-year survival greater than 50%, and poor prognosis was 2-year survival less than 50%. Excuse me. And then, so these boxes are the 95% hazard, or excuse me, are the hazard ratio. The lines to either side are the 95% hazard ratio. And you can see that an interesting pattern emerged. For all the studies with good prognosis, trial patients had similar survival to non-trial patients, with the 95% confidence intervals, including the line of equal hazard, the vertical line. Whereas for nearly all studies with poor prognosis, the risk of death for trial patients was significantly lower. So then the question is, what might explain this very distinct pattern? Well, looking at the individual survival curves, I observed a repeated pattern where there's an early survival advantage for trial patients that seem to wane over time. Indeed, there seems to be an inflection point at about 1 year where the separation between trial and non-trial survival patterns was about at its maximum. So to analyze this further, I created an aggregate data across all diseases. I created a single equally weighted data set of diseases by sampling 50 observations from each of the databases, repeating this 1,000 times to limit sampling bias, and stratifying by good versus poor prognosis. So here really is the main finding. The top 2 figures show the Kaplan-Meier curves for the good and poor prognosis diseases. Up here, the bottom figures are the corresponding hazard functions. You can see that for both the good and poor prognosis patients, the hazard function for the SWOG patients starts out low in both cases, but then increases to meet the hazard function of the SEER patients right at about that 1-year mark. This reflects the fact that though trial patients have better survival in the first year, after the first year, the survival patterns are virtually identical. Finally, I calculated the variation in outcomes attributable to different factors. It turns out that more than 90% of the variation in outcomes is attributable to histology and stage, while less than 2% of the variation was attributable to trial participation. Even in that first year, only about 5% of the variation in outcomes is attributable to trial participation. Therefore, histology and stage really do dominate outcomes. So in summary, trial participation was associated with a 1-year survival advantage. After that first year, survival patterns between trial and non-trial patients were similar, and histology and stage dominated survival patterns. So what might be the reasons for this short-term advantage for trial patients? Well, this trial effect has been described as potentially being due to superior experimental therapy. That wasn't the case here because we excluded the experimental arms. It could be due to being under observation, which is referred to as the Hawthorne effect, although that's unlikely here given that overall survival was the outcome. It could be due to care received according to strict protocol guidelines, for which there is some evidence. But I would say primarily it's due to the fact that trial patients are less ill due to eligibility criteria related to comorbidity. And recall that 60% of all the criteria, eligibility criteria, were related to comorbid illnesses. And that was the one thing that could not be very well controlled for in this comparison. So in conclusion, trial participation was associated with better survival in the first year after diagnosis, likely because of eligibility criteria that exclude higher comorbidity patients from trials. There was similar survival patterns between trial and non-trial patients after the first year, suggesting that trial standard arm outcomes are generalizable potentially over the long term. If trial participation has only a transient or limited impact on outcomes in general, then these results may improve confidence that trial treatment effects will translate to the real-world setting. We hope that these results may serve as a bridge to trials with less strict eligibility criteria, recalling that 60% of all eligibility criteria were related to comorbid illnesses, but still disease and stage dominates the variation in outcomes. Also, consideration could be given to relaxing or limiting criteria where possible, while of course maintaining patient safety, which is always a top concern. Also, fewer eligibility criteria would improve access to clinical trials for a broader cross-section of patients. And lastly, some future studies. I would like to examine whether these findings can be confirmed using Serum Medicare linked database to more precisely account for that treatment component, which we had to sort of estimate in this approach. And I'm especially interested in examining the generalizability of the treatment effect itself, going back to that what I call level 3 generalizability. That's really the nub. That's really what we're after trying to understand. We'd have to do some kind of modeling of the temporal component, but I think it can be done. So thank you.